Welcome to Charity Therapy, the podcast where we explore the ups and downs of the nonprofit sector and answer your burning questions. I'm your host, Jess Birken, owner of Birken Law Office, and I'm excited you're here. Imagine hanging out with me and my super smart, funny nonprofit expert pals. You get to ask them anything about your nitty-gritty nonprofit life and get their wisdom for free. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just strapping on your nonprofit boots, we're here to share stories and remind you you're not alone on this journey. So get ready to join the conversation and bring me the tough questions. I ain't scared. Ready to rock? Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to this episode of Charity Therapy. Today I am joined by Roger Meyer. Roger is the co-owner of Mighty Consulting, a group that helps nonprofits right here in the Twin Cities of Minnesota where I live. Roger, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Great to see you again.
I know, right? I feel like we're conference buddies, but since COVID, I've just not been at many conferences. So it's good to connect. One thing that I want to flesh out before we really jump into the meat and potatoes is I know a big part of the consulting at Mighty is providing interim executive director services. And I feel like this is a service that a lot of people maybe aren't familiar with, or maybe they just don't even know that's a thing. So before we jump into the question, can you just tell us what an interim ED really is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we end up explaining it a lot because there are a whole bunch of people that don't know that they exist for nonprofits, or that if they do know that they exist, they don't know what they do. So really simply, an interim executive director is kind of an executive director who fills in between leadership. So in between an outgoing executive director and the next permanent executive director. And they provide the exact same services that an executive director would, but they're in an interim role, an in-between role. So we say we come pre-fired because everybody knows, hey, when they have an interim, their job isn't to be the permanent. Their job is to be a steward to the organization until the permanent executive director is brought on.
I love that. Pre-fired.
Yeah. It sets the tone. Sets the tone. Yeah.
It does. It does. Okay. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you. Yeah. Let's get into this listener question because it's a good one.
It is.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's do it. Here we go. I serve on the board for a small nonprofit. The organization has been around for almost 7 years, but the entire board turned over 2 years ago. At our board meeting last night, the founder, who's also the executive director, announced that he is resigning. It was a total surprise, but it sounds like his wife got a new job out of the country. And ever since he announced it, I'm kind of freaking out. There's really only one other person besides him who does any active fundraising, and no one on the staff or board has been at the organization for longer than 3 years. Some of my fellow board members are sure it's going to be fine, but they don't seem to understand what we're losing here. How do we survive this transition? I really don't think there's anyone else who can fill the founder's shoes. Man, you can just hear the panic.
You hear the panic. Yeah.
Question.
Yep. It's a great question to set up. Those are the kind of calls Mighty gets on the regular to look for an interim executive director. And I think that the person who asked the question is correct. This is going to be a challenging time for the organization, and there really isn't any way anybody's going to step in and do what the founder did. That was a founder. The board members probably join the board at request of the founder. So the board's probably not fully aware of that they're in charge now. I mean, I think that's...
Okay, wait. I want to stop you there. I love that. I hadn't even thought about that the board who are thinking everything's going to be fine haven't realized that they are in charge now.
Correct. Yep. We see that a lot. And I'm sure you see it in your legal work. Boards are really not operating as if they're the owners of the organization, but in our nonprofit legal structure, they are. The executive director is replaceable. The staff are replaceable. When shit goes wrong or goes right, it's that board that owns that organization. So in this case, now all the things that organization were doing are now the board's responsibility.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And I always say the buck stops with the board. So that's absolutely correct.
And maybe they know that in theory. And while they have that founder, they're more than happy to let the founder be the decision maker or own all of that and just cheer them on. But in a transition like the one this caller mentioned, that's no longer enough. You can't do that anymore because you don't have that founder, or you will shortly not have that founder. And I mean, so I think the organization needs to rally that board, whether it's the caller or the board chair or the outgoing executive director. Somebody needs to kind of let everybody know that, hey, we're in charge now. This is now all the issues that came to us after they went through the executive director come to us now first, and really get the board aware of their responsibilities, not in a big picture like, hey, let's do a board training, but like in a, hey, we now have to pivot and become more aware of what the organization is doing and give good guidance to that. And again, we're not selling services always, but somehow they have to put in place leadership.
They don't tell us how many staff they have, but
right.
My sort of like sense reading between the lines is this is not a large team.
No, that's what it sounded like too.
Yeah, like one other person besides the ED does fundraising. Well, that tells me there's not a fundraising department, and they've only been around for 7 years.
Right.
It's probably a pretty small team.
Right.
But I know as a lawyer, you'd be surprised how quickly things can get out of hand if you don't actually step in and say what the chain of command sort of is.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We hosted a happy hour where we made up our own drink names. And the strongest drink we made up was called the leadership vacuum. And it was like the equivalent. It was like the equivalent of a Long Island iced tea because nothing gets you messed up faster than a leadership vacuum.
Oh, my God. I love that so much. I don't want to drink one, though.
No, you don't. And you don't want to be a part of an organization that has a leadership vacuum.
Yes.
So that's what's important for this organization to do is put in place something. Again, if it's not an interim because they can't get one, or if it's, establish the executive committee as the transition committee, just be clear with the board and with the staff, here's how we're going to make decisions in this transition.
Yeah. And
so that,
one of the things, like if you happen to be an executive director listening to this and you know you're going to be transitioning, also maybe don't do this. Don't create the leadership vacuum. Now, I know there are scenarios where it can't be helped. You have to give a sudden notice, but this is really not an ideal leadership transition to just say, oh, by the way, I'm done, and leave everyone sort of clambering to figure out how they're going to fill that leadership hole.
Right.
If this were my client, I talk to a lot of executive directors, and if they were to call me and say, hey, I'm really thinking about moving on, or, my spouse is up for this job, which would take me so far away that I can't do this anymore, I would be encouraging them to let someone know that we need to start working on a succession plan. And maybe even they identify an interim executive director, or at least tell someone. Because this is like, I don't want this board member to panic, but I get why they're panicking.
It's a big deal. It's a big deal. And again, it can be existential for some organizations if they're close to the edge financially, or if truly it's a founder organization and nobody else really has any idea or connection to the work that's happening, right?
Yeah.
But to your point, I think when we're interims, we're stewards. That's how we position our work, because we do interims for organizations we didn't know existed 2 weeks ago. Right. So we're not selling expertise in the organization. We're selling expertise in managing people and resources and navigating transition. But it could be that this executive director could have spent time having candid conversations with the board prior to, hey, I'm leaving in 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 2 weeks. They could have been having like, hey, I will eventually leave. There's not a nonprofit in the world that has the same executive director through their whole life cycle unless it goes out of business when they leave.
Yeah. To some degree, we're all pre-fired.
Well, absolutely. And that, again, that's the mentality we take, but it's pretty infrequent to have an executive director thinking like that until they're ready. They don't want to engage with the board in case the board says, yeah, you're right, we don't really need you around anymore.
Yeah.
So there's
and
always
especially
that
a founder. Because usually the founder is like, this is my legacy I'm leaving to the world. This was my idea. This is my creation. They're not thinking my best clients are thinking someday I won't be here.
Right.
But very typically in the nonprofit sector, that person is not thinking about succession planning.
That'll be on this caller's mind is like, all right, what they'll have to decide and negotiate very quickly with this outgoing executive director. Look, how can we get what's going to be happening in the next 1 month and 6 months that you can convey to us, the board, so that we can put a plan together, right? The thing we look for in transition is intentionality. So, and whether that's because they have a succession plan and it's a very intentional transition, or it's like this, where from this point forward, they can be intentional, right?
Yeah.
The quicker
shit hit the fan, now what?
Yeah, exactly. But you can still be intentional about that by asking the right questions, as opposed to just like always reactive, right?
Yeah.
And making decisions not based on a little bit of thought and a little bit of intentionality, but like, oh my God, we have to put somebody in charge. Let's have this person do it, even though they don't know what's going on, or they
like,
elevate.
Oh, don't promote the one other staff person who happens to touch fundraising to be the executive director.
Right. And again,
that's so common. It's just like, you're standing there. Yeah, you do it. It's like, no.
Yeah. And again, what we see again is boards now more than ever. It's always been a little bit not so great in the nonprofit sector, but post-COVID, we're seeing boards really not stepping up when needed. And during any type of transition like this, the board is going to have to change their level of engagement and what they're doing.
Yeah. I want to circle back to that because that connects with the thing you said about, the organization's financial outlook and the idea that some of the board members who think it's going to be fine maybe have no idea what the financial picture is. Maybe they have no idea. And we don't have a lot here to go off of. But if their fundraising is very relationship based and our charismatic leader is the face and has the relationships, for all we know, this is the treasurer writing in and they know something financially we don't, right? Or they're just clearly understanding the way that the fundraising is happening is not something you can just swap in and swap out. So like that idea that like you may a little bit, there's like a Pollyanna effect of like, oh, it'll be fine. Because you actually don't know. So I feel like one of those early intentions would be to get very educated about the nuts and bolts of what is going on and what is the financial picture. Yep.
Well, and that's, what we do in this, I would recommend this caller, when we get asked to be an interim and when we get the contract, if there's an outgoing executive director still there, we provide a template to capture at a high level, what are you working on programmatically? What are you working on financially? What are you working on fundraising? High level, executive director level, so that we can capture that outgoing person's. Again, like, we don't know this organization. Maybe they have a gala coming up in 2 months that's already behind schedule, right? And so we do our best, and this board member need to do their best to really understand, like, this is a business, right? I mean, it's a nonprofit, but it's an organization. It has revenue and it has expenses and it has outputs or activities or whatever you want to call it. They just need to quickly get a way to get their collective brain around it so that they can deal with the transition and navigate towards the next executive director.
Yep.
The end goal is not to remain in transition any longer than you need, to move through it and hand it off to another executive director.
And what do you think about the idea that the whole board turned over 2 years ago?
Yeah.
I mean, it's only a 7-year-old organization.
Right.
Usually I'm like, oh, that's terrible because we lost all of our institutional knowledge. But honestly, they've been there for a third, 2/3.
Right. And my concern isn't their length of time there. It's why are they there and what's their engagement level? Some of these founder organizations just get friends and family, kind of, maybe not family, to sit on the board. And if it's like a quarterly board meeting, 2/3 of them show up, they get the packet, they nod their head, they cheer them on, and then they go back to their life. That's not going to work anymore. And so the 2 to 3 years doesn't faze me. It's do they know enough to handle this transition or to step into this transition?
I see that all the time. I work with a lot of emerging organizations and startups, and I try so hard, if they're going to have people on the board, like, to educate my clients about, you really want to have people who are invested in the mission, not just people who are going to show up and say yes to whatever you want.
Correct.
And it's, again, we don't have a ton to go on here, but I'm like, oh yeah, like those people on the board who are like, it's fine.
Fine. And that might be
it. Could be. They're just like, oh, that's great for you.
Right.
That's great.
They might not actually care too deeply if you're like, we don't know what kind of organization it is, if they're not receiving services from it or don't have a direct impact to the mission. Like maybe it's going to be okay because it doesn't have any impact on them, whether it's successful or not. They're not bought in. And it's so easy to be like, oh, that'll be fine. I just tune in once every 3 months and everything goes fine. So, but that all assumes a person leading and managing. And they're about to have nobody leading and nobody managing, which are, the two elements of executive directordom. So I mean, lean it into that. Again, it doesn't need to be a interim consultant. They just need to put in place, here's how we're going to lead and manage the organization during this time.
Yeah. And let's be real, like for some very small organizations, hiring an interim is financially out of reach.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Yep.
So it may not be possible to hire an interim ED and have them swoop in and sort of like clean everything up. And what I always tell clients when I'm encouraging them to consider hiring an interim is I'm like, listen, there are so many unknown unknowns right now.
Right.
This person could have been plugging all of the holes in the dike with all of their fingers. Once they pull all their fingers out, everything's chaos because nobody knows what anything is. You don't want to hire someone into this mess. And one of the things I like for clients about an interim ED is like, let's get our arms around everything.
Right.
And that's what y'all do, right? It's like, you're inheriting a mess and you have no reservations about that. You're like, this is the work. Then I will clean it up and it will be nice and tidy and hopefully organized for the next person who gets recruited and hired properly into this role. And I think that's kind of like the nut there is like, don't just promote the next person in line and make them figure it out. The board, whether they step up by spending money and hiring help or whether they step in and be that leadership, expect that it is going to be messy. I want to validate this person's thought that this is bigger than people think it is. It absolutely is. And stepping up and stepping in and making sure that transition is handled well is really good.
Well, on something you just said, do not rush into your next hire until you know enough to hire the right person. Like you need to know if it's a cluster and it's in real bad shape. It's not fair to hire somebody and say, oh, now you can save, like now it's yours to clean up because that person probably won't last. They'll be angry at the misleading nature. So it really is important. And again, ideally, you get an interim, they do 6 months worth of work, you have a nice orderly search, but these small organizations often don't have the luxury of that, but do have some intention, understand what's going on, understand enough to know what the next executive director is going to have to focus on before you go into the hiring process. Just promoting the next in command or grabbing somebody on a posting on Indeed, it's just not going to end well.
Right. And not to mention, I see a lot of founders who work for less than fair market wages. And you may have a little bit of a difficult reality in understanding that your next executive director is not going to work for 25 grand a year or 36,000 a year. It may be very difficult to hire, all the more reason to not just jump into that.
Right. I think the other thing that we end up doing or that the board might get guidance from, we don't know this board, how many of them know anything about the nonprofit sector. To your last point, we have a lot of boards that are primarily corporate people. And they're kind of on the dated mentality of like, oh, people get to work in the nonprofit. We don't have to pay them that much. So even if an organization can't afford an interim, sometimes it's helpful to bring in an outside consultant just to help educate the board on, hey, here's what we're seeing in hiring. Here's what your sector is going through, because again, we assume the board does not know the depths they need to step in and run the organization. So even if it's not a big consulting contract for ongoing interim, but it is like, hey, we need to educate ourselves or become more aware of what's going on out there. Let's bring in some people to have a conversation with the board so that the board is cohesive and can work together through the transition.
Yeah, I love that recommendation because it is like that kind of financial middle ground that is something that might be accessible for a lot of groups, for sure. Okay, I've got what I think are some takeaways here, and feel free to jump in. First is just like, hey, remember, the board is always the final authority. It's not just like, oh, somebody else does this. You do this. You
own the organization.
You do it by delegating to other people sometimes. And then number two, in the case that first of all, in all cases, but in the case that you are losing your executive director, make sure you look at the financial picture. Be thinking, how are we going to sustain? How does our fundraising work? Will we be able to continue that work? And what do we need to do to continue to financially sustain this organization? And then three, and I think this is really like the linchpin of everything, is be intentional.
Be intentional.
No matter if this was a planned succession or an emergency, stuff hitting the fan, do not just shoot from the hip and see how it goes.
Right.
Be intentional. And that seems to me to be like the root of everything. It's like whether you hire a consultant for a little bit or a lot of bit, you need to be thinking through everything and not just reacting and panicking. So while it is okay to like be emotional and be like, oh no, this is a big deal, give yourself some space to like sleep on it and then start making a plan, not just making random decisions.
Agreed.
Anything else?
Well, I mean, the thing on that last bit, what people really like about interims, the way at least we get good feedback on, steady hand at the helm, whether it's other board members, your staff, the community you serve, the funders, they deserve to see an organization that's being intentional and making good decisions. They'll understand if you have to say, hey, we have to cut this program or this is what's happening. They'll react badly if you do that without telling them why. And if it just if they think, oh, they're just, what the hell's going on, But if you say, hey, we're going through a transition, here's who's in charge and here's what we're going to be doing, they understand.
Yep.
But if you're not intentional and you're just reactive, they won't understand and they'll wonder why you're doing what you're doing. So it is that.
Yeah. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy to the bottom right there.
Yep,
because then nobody wants to donate and nobody wants to participate and now you're done.
Correct. The only other takeaway I would add is, and it goes back to your first point, and this is something I'm sure you see, the board is a collective of individuals, but it can only make decisions and work if they agree on things enough to pass votes with majority. So you need to spend a little time, this caller, on making sure that you have a cohesive way of operating as a board during this transition.
Yeah,
and that
absolutely
sometimes is missing when it's been a founding executive director and the board really hasn't figured out how to navigate with each other as fellow board members, how to make challenging decisions. So
100%. Well said. Roger, thank you so much for being here. I think this was an absolute value bomb. I appreciate you laying all that out for people. If folks want to connect with you and learn more about what you do, where can they find you online?
Yeah, go to mightyconsulting.org. And we think we've done a pretty good job of laying out the services we offer and how we do them, kind of in a no jargon, no bullshit kind of way, and really getting to help these smaller nonprofit organizations. So
that's right. That's why you're my people.
That's why we get along well.
That's right. Folks, if you enjoyed this no bullshit episode, do me a huge favor. Share it with a friend. Rate, review, subscribe in your podcast app. It really does help me out. It helps people find the podcast. Big shout out to the listeners. Thank you so much for listening every episode. I get emails and I love to hear from you. So do shoot us an email. If you have a question or a story to share, I would love to hear from you. Send me a note online at charitytherapy.show. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thanks, Jess.